The first hit snapped through the Sherman like a hammer through a bell. The commander's headset jumped sideways as the turret rang with a metal scream that didn't fade. It vibrated through the hull, through boots and ribs and teeth. Dust shook loose from the ceiling. Paint flakes drifted in the air like gray snow. "Hit! We're hit!" Outside, U.S. infantry scattered against the walls of the French street, rifles pressed to stone. The tank had been leading the battalion's push through the town, crawling forward as a steel shield for the riflemen. Now that shield was being dismantled in front of them. The driver kept the engines screaming. A second shell slammed the turret. For one suspended instant, the crew waited for the flash, the white bloom that meant ammunition cook-off, the moment when a Sherman stopped being a vehicle and became a furnace. It didn't come. They were still moving. "Two!" the loader shouted, counting without meaning to. A third strike hammered the side armor. The hull jerked sideways. A cone of spall burst inward, metal fragments slicing through the compartment like shrapnel rain. The infantry outside flattened themselves against doorways as sparks sprayed from the tank's flank. Still no explosion. The commander realized what street they were in. The Germans had pre-sighted the road. This wasn't resistance. This was a kill zone. Muzzle flashes blinked at the far end between rubble and sandbags. The Sherman had driven straight into a funnel built to erase armor. Walls boxed them in. No room to turn, no cover. Just a corridor designed for execution. Another hit. The crew braced. Nothing. The tank kept rolling, wounded but alive, as if it refused to understand it had already been sentenced. 4! The number hung inside the hull with the smell of burned steel. Every man in the tank knew the math. Armor only held for so long. Sooner or later, one shell would punch clean through and the interior would vanish in fire. They weren't counting hits to survive. They were counting down to the one that would end them. And somewhere ahead, another German gun was already lining up the shot. The Sherman was still moving. That was the part none of them understood. 4 direct hits and the tank was crawling forward, engine howling, tracks grinding against cobblestone, while American infantry hugged the walls on both sides. Riflemen glanced at the armored hull, like men watching a wounded animal refuse to fall. Inside the turret, the crew waited for the detonation that should already have happened. It didn't arrive. Between one impact and the next, there was a silence so thin it cut. In that silence lived a single thought shared by every tanker in every army. Why are we still alive? Most tanks didn't get a second chance. A clean penetration turned the interior into a pressure cooker. Fuel, ammunition, men igniting in the same breath. Crews vanished mid-motion. No warning, no counting. Yet this Sherman kept absorbing punishment like it hadn't read the rules. Another muzzle flash flickered at the end of the street. Time stretched. Before the next shell crossed the air, before the moment the tank either survived again or didn't, you have to rewind to when the battalion first rolled into the town, when the advance still felt procedural, when infantry and armor moved like parts of a machine that believed it controlled the battlefield. Because kill zones don't look like traps from the outside. They look like progress. And this one had been waiting patiently for the first American tank to enter it. 10 minutes earlier, the advance had felt methodical. The armored battalion pushed into the French town at walking speed, Shermans spaced carefully, infantry squads flowing alongside them like shadows. Doctrine said tanks without infantry were blind. Infantry without tanks were exposed. Together they moved as one organism, steel and flesh covering each other's weaknesses. The commander stood half out of the turret, binoculars sweeping upper windows. The street looked abandoned. Doors hung open. Curtains stirred in broken frames. The town carried that strange quiet unique to places the war had just passed through. Not peace, just the absence of visible motion. "Keep it tight," he told the driver. "Infantry close." Riflemen tapped the hull as they advanced, a silent reassurance. "We're here." The Sherman rolled forward as their shield, its armor absorbing the fear they didn't say out loud. Every man trusted the machine, not because it was invincible, but because it bought them time to react. What none of them saw were the guns already aimed down the street. At the far end, Concealed behind rubble and camouflage netting, German anti-tank crews lay in wait. The road had been measured days earlier, distances marked, angles memorized. The kill zone wasn't improvised, it was engineered. The Sherman entered exactly where the gunners expected. The commander felt unease before he understood why. The street was too straight, too open. No wreckage forcing a detour, no abandoned vehicle narrowing the path. It was a corridor designed for movement, and anything designed for movement could be redesigned for killing. He opened his mouth to order a halt. The first gun fired. The shell crossed the distance faster than thought and slammed into the tank's frontal armor with a crack that erased the illusion of control. And the ambush woke up. The second shot came before the echo of the first faded. Then the third. The street turned into a firing lane. A shell smashed into the turret and the Sherman lurched sideways, vision slits flashing white. The gunner lost the sight picture completely. The loader slammed into the breach, helmet cracking steel. Inside the hull, the air filled with powdered rust and insulation. The taste of the tank tearing itself apart. 5! Outside, American infantry dove flat, rifles snapping toward the far end of the road. They couldn't silence the guns from here. The tank was taking the punishment meant for all of them. Another impact hammered the side armor. Spall burst inward in a glittering cone, metal shards scything through the compartment. The driver shouted as fragments ripped across his sleeve. Not a penetration. Close enough to feel the heat. 6! The engine coughed. The Sherman staggered forward on wounded tracks, speed bleeding away. German guns fired with mechanical patience. They weren't rushing. They knew the math favored them. 7. 8. Each hit should have been fatal. The crew braced for the ammunition to ignite, for the interior to become a furnace. Sweat pooled in gloves. Every breath tasted like burned steel and fear. 9. The gunner's optics shattered. He aimed half-blind now, staring through cracks and instinct. The Sherman wasn't fighting anymore. It was enduring. 10. The hull felt paper-thin. The commander understood with icy clarity that the next clean penetration would not wound them. It would erase them. Another muzzle flash bloomed through the smoke at the end of the street. Inside the tank, 5 men waited in a machine already condemned, listening to the incoming shell write the final line. Or miss it. The next shell struck and screamed away. Instead of punching through, it skidded across the Sherman's angled hull in a shower of sparks and vanished down the street. The tank rocked violently but held. For half a heartbeat, the crew stared at each other through smoke and dust, stunned by the fact they were still intact. The commander snapped back first. "Angle the hull! Angle it!" The driver wrenched the controls. The Sherman pivoted just enough to change its armor profile. It wasn't escape. It was geometry. Flat steel died fast. Sloped steel bought seconds. Another German shot cracked through the smoke. It hit at a sharper angle and ricocheted, shrieking off into the buildings. "Smoke! Smoke now!" The launcher fired. White clouds exploded around the tank, swallowing the street in a blinding curtain. Enemy gunners lost their sight picture instantly. The kill zone dissolved into fog. Outside, American infantry surged forward under cover of the smoke, rifles hammering toward the hidden positions. Grenades arced. The ambush began to fracture. "Reverse! Get us out!" The driver slammed the Sherman backward. The wounded engine rattled in protest, but the tracks bit into the stone and dragged the tank out of the funnel 1 brutal meter at a time. Blind fire snapped through the haze. 1 shell punched past the turret and detonated behind them. Missed. The Sherman slid behind a collapsed wall, and the impact stopped. Silence crashed into the hull. No ringing steel, no screaming fragments. Just the engine knocking like an exhausted heart, and the distant crack of infantry finishing the fight the tank had survived. The crew didn't celebrate. They listened, waiting for the next hit. It never came. And slowly, carefully, the men inside the Sherman realized they had crossed an invisible boundary, from certain death into survival they hadn't earned. only stolen. When the hatches opened, the air felt thin. The crew climbed out of the Sherman one by one, boots uncertain, hands still trembling from impacts their bodies hadn't processed yet. Infantry moved past them in short bursts, clearing the last resistance. Someone clapped the hull as he ran by. Not celebration, just recognition. The tank had taken the street's anger and lived. The Sherman sat crooked behind the broken wall, engine ticking as it cooled. Up close, the armor looked unreal. The hull was cratered and folded, paint burned to naked steel. Impact scars puckered the turret like fists frozen mid-strike. Mechanics and riflemen gathered around without speaking at first, hands tracing the damage, counting the marks the way survivors count lightning strikes. 1, 2, 3. They stopped at 11. No clean penetration, no catastrophic cook-off. Just a machine that had absorbed more violence than anyone thought survivable, and a crew that stayed inside it long enough to make the one decision that mattered. The commander rested his palm against the hull. It was still warm, humming faintly with trapped heat. He didn't feel victorious. He felt temporary. Every tanker understood the truth armor taught quickly. Steel didn't make you immortal. It bought you moments. Moments to think. Moments to move. Moments to choose discipline instead of panic. That day, 11 hits had tried to end the argument. The crew answered with angle, smoke, and refusal to freeze. The battalion would move on. The town would fall. Reports would compress the fight into clean lines of text. No document would carry the sound of each impact, the bell-ringing violence that counted down to 0 and somehow stopped short. But the men inside that Sherman would carry it forever. Because in armored warfare, survival isn't triumph. It's the quiet realization that death fired 11 times and missed.